sort of question of the symbols and who can use them, who can alter them, is kind of at the heart of what we're talking about. Actually, it's interesting. There's sort of two different things that go on, I think, in these controversies. One is, you know, for example, with the Danish cartoons, whether you are representing things that are not supposed to be represented. And the other thing is whether you are taking symbols that are out there, that are a part of another, of a religion, and using them, altering them, doing something to them. And it's interesting, I mean, there's sort of two, so it's iconoclasm versus a kind of, I guess, a kind of, you know, icons that are accepted and altered. So there's sort of these two different strains that we seem to be dealing with. Boryana, I wanted to ask you to talk a little bit about, in the case of your husband's work here, again, we have a very potent religious symbol there, the crucifixion, which he uses in his film. What were his intentions, and why was the response so virulent? As Svetlana was mentioning, there seems to be a kind of newly militant kind of orthodoxy in certain parts of the former Soviet Union that maybe plays into this.
Yeah, I can say a few words about his intentions and the art piece itself, but it seems to me that besides that, it is very important to look at his work and the reaction to it within a bigger context. First, the context of Russia today. Second, the context of Eastern Europe today. And third, the global context of exchange of conservative opinion about art. So first, his intention. He was making a film which was based on a real story about two artists, and one of them killed his friend because of professional envy. Afterwards, he decided, this is the story of the film, he decided to repent and to change, in order to show his sincerity, he changed the means, the artistic means that he used, which were oil on canvas, and he decided to become a performance artist and engage in direct action. And the first thing he did was this crucifixion, which was addressing the issue of what is most important for the artist, the commercial success or the social responsibility. And within the context of the Russian society, I forgot to mention that Oleg was the director of the film. He's a filmmaker, also an artist, and he was also acting as the main character. Also, he's one of the major representatives of the Russian actionism, which is a movement from the 90s, which is involved in direct action or interventions on the streets. It's a movement which is currently researched, and there are many books written about it. So therefore, he decided to make this real, and he didn't really want to have an actor for that. So he made that, and also the press came there, and his performance was shown prime time on the news, on the national TV, and even I in Bulgaria, before I knew him, I saw it, because Russian TV, national TV, some of the stations are transmitted in Bulgarian. So he wanted to also address, with his body involvement, the fusion between the church and the state, which is a process that began in the early 90s. And this is a process that began all over Eastern Europe. And this became actually increased. He was actually the second artist who was persecuted under the law 282 for inciting religious and national hatred. Before him, there is another one who lives now in political exile in Prague. His name is David Wojnarowicz. And since 2000, when Oleg escaped from Russia, there is an escalation of persecutions of artists, cultural producers, even whole shows that have been persecuted under the same law 282 for inciting religious hatred, in particular towards the Orthodox Church, which is the official religion. Since then, there are about 10 cases of people who have been convicted. Two artists are now in jail, and also there are some very absurd cases, like the conviction of the famous writer Leo Tolstoy. You all probably know him. He died a long time ago, but he was convicted posthumously last year by 3 different courts in Russia for leaflets that he wrote against the First World War. and the participation of the church as a facilitator and promoter of the participation of Russia in the war. So this is, I think, and this was just last year. And therefore, actually, last year there was a celebration of 100 years since his death, and this was cancelled, so nobody in Russia really celebrated it. In the context of Eastern Europe, this thing that is happening in Russia, it's like a hardcore case. The people who you saw, those are people who are representatives of different right-wing Orthodox fundamentalist circles who are protesting not only against Oleg's piece, but against all these shows, among which was Attention Religion, which was in 2003, and another one which was called Forbidden Art in 2005. I'm not going to explain more about these things. They're very interesting to be analyzed, like you did with your piece, but there's so many, there's a very rich material there. But the most important thing is that in order to sue these people, or the artists, or the curators, there is something which is used, which is called expertise, which is usually made by professionals who work in museums, but they usually don't work in the field of contemporary art. They work in the field of, let's say, medieval painting or something like this. And they make an expertise, they write how offensive all these works are, and they completely misinterpret them, like Wojnarowicz's piece, like many other things. So it's a very interesting reading, actually, to really get into it. But as to go towards the global tendency, in Eastern Europe there is this tendency of fusion between the church and the state, especially in Poland, as you showed one piece, but there are other cases of censorship in Poland. In Bulgaria there is another type of, it is not exactly a fusion, but the Orthodox Church has been used to describe or to determine what is the national identity. And this kind of going towards national identity related to the church identity or to religious identity is something like a backlash to the European Union or to the globalizing tendency in European Union. And globally, it seems to me that although we see that the global market changes our lives, we see globalization, cultural globalization through internet and through many other medias, an exchange of culture, but we never ever thought about, or probably not until now, about this globalization as a tool or as a mean for consolidation of conservative tendencies in different societies that can go back and forth. Like, for instance, Oleg's piece was actually, and he was not really shown in Europe for the last 10 years, but he was shown here in the United States in the Museum of Contemporary Art in Denver with the same very piece, which was, again, provoked a reaction from, I don't remember who, but the curator, it was, again, around Christmas. So this piece was required to be taken down because of the Christmas show, and there was a threat that there will be a budget cut, and the budget cut happened, but the curator, Sidney Payton, refused to take it down, which was, to me, it was a very brave and really responsible kind of behavior. And what we see now with Wojnarowicz, it seems to me that maybe I'll sound very hard, but it is shameful for a museum to take an art piece from an art show.
It is interesting, though, listening to your discussion of the situation in the former Soviet Union. I mean, here the biggest danger seems to be, removal of the piece and the cutting of funding. Not jail, exile, etc. Which actually brings me to Shirin. You're talking of, in Russia, it's not an official theocracy. Iran is an official theocracy. And so that, of course, plays into what can be seen. You can't go back because of the kinds of works that you are doing, even though your work is known there and I think seen. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that, and also about, in terms of Women Without Men, the kinds of things that are in that film that would make it unseeable in Iran, or unofficially unseeable.
Well, I would like to begin by just making more of a general remark that when you consider censorship within the Western culture and non-Western culture, you're talking about two different scenarios. Basically, what you have here is the freedom of expression, which in my opinion is the principle of an idea of democracy. When you're talking about Iran, we have no democracy. Therefore, the idea of freedom of expression is obsolete. So the way that the artists, and obviously Americans, are fighting very much, and myself, I'm considering myself an American as well, to protect the idea of democracy. Now, the situation in Iran is very different. We have never known democracy, and censorship has been a way of life. And therefore, our personal lives have been very much defined by governments that are dictatorships and oppressive. Therefore, we have no mental, emotional, political possibility to distance ourselves from the question of politics. Now, I say politics and then religion. In our case, it was Islamic revolution, so it came with it the question of religion and politics. I can speak personally first to say that I've never found myself interested in criticizing religion. And my value is that people have the rights to believe in what they believe in. I have no interest in disrespecting and questioning their faith. And I have myself, consider myself slightly religious, and I like to be left alone with that. But nevertheless, my work at the beginning, Woman of Allah, was never intended to criticize that part of the Islamic revolution. But what I did become critical is the way in which this dictatorship redefined Islam to make it a political Islam. It was no longer religion, it was no longer faith, but it was the wrong interpretation of Islam. Therefore, I myself give myself every freedom to criticize the government in my own way. Now, going back to outside of me, the situation of Iranian artists today is really incredible. As oppressive, as impossible the situation is, with censorship, with harassment, with arrest, with imprisonment, torture, and even execution, oddly enough, Iranian artists are finding themselves central to the cultural discourse, to the political discourse. And this is unlike your situation in America, where you would only get provoked if an artist does touch the question of religion. Some people get excited and discuss that, but we are really directly at risk. And this risk, in a way, is making us more important to our community. Our artists are not just decorators, and I'm not saying Western artists are. We're not artists just to be hanging our work at museums and galleries, but we are communicators, both to our own people and to the people in the outside world. So I'm only making this point not to make something special about us, but I'm saying that all of us, our personal lives, has been affected, whether we're living in exile, we have no more access to our country, or in Iran that they're literally censored or they're imprisoned. Like Jafar Panahi is the greatest filmmaker in Iran, who is given the term of 6 years in prison, 20 years of no writing and no directing. Now, in terms of what The Woman Without Land was really, again, not a point of an activism that I want to directly make a film that criticized the government, but again, to create a dialogue with my own people and to the Westerners. And somehow, I have never been able throughout my career to separate my psyche as an artist, as someone who's deeply interested in existential, philosophical elements with the question of politics. So this film was once again trying to make art that also has some relevance to the political reality. And I don't want to go into detail about Woman Without Land, that would take too long, but I just want to just give you an idea of the mental, emotional, and political state that Iranian artists are today, particularly. That on one side they're very much victims, on the other hand they're extremely empowered.
You know, on the one hand, this kind of virulent censorship and suppression is makes lives very difficult for artists, but then there's also a sense in which art becomes so much more important. And Shoja, I wanted to talk a little bit about, in terms of your work, these images that I showed, the popular images that you derive them from, in fact, have been used as tools of resistance. So it's interesting that religion, in this particular case, religious imagery can also be used in a kind of political and kind of more liberating way. And I'd be curious to know more about first that, and also how your alterations of it relate to that role.
I want to just continue with what Shirin was saying, and then I'll go back to my specific work. I think that the situation in Iran is that you really are dealing with a totalitarian regime. It's a theocracy. So every aspect of human life, basically, from personal to political to religious, is pretty much under control. So any movement, and I mean any movement, would be questioned by the regime. So it is the situation that basically you have no choice. If you make art, it becomes political. If you use your veil, your scarf, it becomes political. It's a situation that is every aspect of life is controlled by that. But more specifically is this populist nature of the regime and the way that basically religious fervor and religious iconography has been used as a tool of agitation, of basically fascistic mobilization of the culture. It started with the revolution, but it has moved into pretty much a very dominant fascistic kind of organization. And unfortunately, we don't have internet here. I would have shown you some of the clips of some of these agitators that use like this sacred imagery, that I have used basically, in addition to singing and sometimes even like this really popular songs that they were love songs, they were very intimate songs. And they have incorporated all of that together into this amalgam of propaganda. And they use these images, these iconographies, these religious songs and everything, bringing people actually, like organizing people, bringing thugs out to attack demonstrations and really like, suppress any kind of movement that exists in Iran. Having said that, my work is related to basically, and a lot of other artists in Iran, is basically to take away the ownership of this kind of iconography, this kind of images that are sacred to the regime. And the entire like movement in 2009. It is interesting that basically it hid itself under like basically form motives, and that it could not even question the idea of like a secular movement, because it couldn't position itself as a secular movement. So it wanted to, the whole movement was to appropriate this religious system, religious theocracy, the theocracy that exists, and just reform it to a lesser fascistic and more democratic mode. And during this time, the idea of martyrdom, of course, is essential in this kind of iconography. So this people that were like falling on the streets of Tehran, that you all probably remember the image of Neda, Abu Sultan, who was murdered on the street. So this idea of like this fallen woman became like a kind of martyr. And this idea of martyrdom that the regime was using was being used by the opposition to counter attack the regime. And so this series of work was informed by that, taking these sacred icons and basically making them modern, making them today, and appropriating this imagery in response to the basically oppression of the regime. But having said that, I want to also mention something else. Why this religious fervor? Where is the inception of this religious fervor? I mean, there is also a shift in Western mentality. I think before even the Islamic Revolution in Iran, you have this idea of a green belt around the Soviet Union, during the Carter era, that a lot of the funding of the U.S. went to creating, helping Taliban in Afghanistan, and also the ideas of basically creating a religious alternative to counter the communism at the time, during the Cold War. And I think that basically these ideas of religion and religious attack and the evil that Islam was essential basically for this duality of the ideology between the Western, between the American at least, paradigm. And now you could see that how basically false this thing has been by looking at what is happening in Egypt. I mean, the Egyptian uprising and what is happening there was resisted by dictators. They created these scarecrows of like radical Islam that would take over all over the world. And you could now see that basically this has been a selling point for the dictators and also a propaganda tool of the Western media and Western governments to create these scarecrows. And hopefully this uprising would start to make a dent into this kind of control.
I think what's very interesting here, and sort of what's coming up in kind of all of the things that people are saying, is this interesting relationship, the kind of dangerous often relationship between art and between religion and politics, and the way in which, especially when religion becomes too closely aligned with political power, it becomes a very sort of noxious situation. We see it in a small way here in this country, in the sense that, we have the political, the right wing, sees art as a very useful target for, or as a scapegoat, in a much smaller way than what Jojo was talking about, the way in which radical Islam has become a scapegoat internationally. But here, artists, religious art that deals with religious symbols becomes a kind of scapegoat, a way of sort of dealing with these other larger issues. But it's very interesting how it's when there's this kind of alignment, this sense here that we have sometimes, that with the religious right, declaring that this is a Christian country, and that all of this debate about, the founders, and were they religious or were they not religious, and what were their intentions, and all of these sorts of issues that come up. What becomes clear is that the separation of church and state is such an incredibly vital thing for not only for the vitality of democracy, but in a sense for the vitality of religion, which otherwise gets corrupted by this kind of power. So that's one thing I feel is sort of coming up. The other thing that's interesting in what everybody is talking about as well is the kind of the notion of religious symbols, and that in a way that they have a potential flexibility. Some of the things that Shirin and Shoja are talking about in particular, the way that you can use religious symbols as instruments of resistance, as well as these kind of augmenting authoritarian tendencies of the political establishment. And so I guess what what I want to try to get into here a little bit is this, what often when religious symbols are altered, there's, in this country, of course, we begin to talk about, is it an example of hate speech, and certainly William Donahue of the Catholic League, is constantly combing, every art show for examples of hate speech against Catholicism anytime any, kind of Christian image, Christian symbol is used. So the question is, I guess, is there a line between hate speech and this kind of creative use of symbols? Do we is there a point at which it does become hate speech? For example, the Danish cartoons. What did that go too far? What about this question of religious symbols and sort of balancing the I guess the feelings of the religious community versus the artist's ability to use these in some way, and often use these in a creative way that may in fact be productive politically, as happens in Iran, and as Shojan was telling us. So I guess that I'd like to try to get into that question a little bit. I don't know if anybody here would like to pick up on that, but this question of what about this question of hate speech? I mean, I think you ran into this, right? I mean, what's the line here? Is there a line? Do we have a line?
When I was coming here, and I realized that you folks were coming as well, I had some apprehension about my tearing up the Koran. And then when you had mentioned, just in the beginning of your comments, that you have some religion, and so I have some apprehension about what I have done. I would do the same thing again, I should say. I don't think that it's hate speech. I think what happens in hate speech is used by a political movement to sort of generate an enormous amount of fear. And in my particular case, I think that's what happened. The fear was just so palpable that what I had done was I had cut up sacred books. Now, when I say that at the moment myself, I think, maybe that was not so cool. So that notion of self-censorship begins to arise in my own head. And I think that's the road which the religious right and the political right starts to go down. That, am I questioning myself? That, well, yes, my intentions were to create this common ground, but maybe I blew it because I wasn't deep enough. I wasn't thinking about it as clear as I could have. I wasn't aware of the different points of view coming out of it.
And I haven't seen your work, so I don't want to criticize it, but I just want to emphasize the need for boundary. Even though I absolutely believe in freedom of expression, I believe in celebrating our differences and values and maintaining our values, and not thinking that there's only one way to think, one way to live. I know this may be an overstatement for some people like Shojan.
To answer your question, I would like to burn all the books. What is really interesting, I mean, Koran and all the others all together. What is really interesting is that I was raised as an atheist. From the time I remember, I basically didn't believe in God, and I was at war with religious orthodoxy. Then I come here. I've been here for some 27 years. And especially after September 11, every time that someone asks me, so what is your religion, here? And I say, I don't have one. I'm an atheist. They don't believe it. I said, no. Where are you from? Iran. So you're Muslim, right? I said, well, no, I'm not. So what I want to get into is that basically, I think that it is also the intention of the political right, and this fervor, this rise of fanaticism that has been taking over the whole place, is not the intention of basically let's toward this sacred iconography, and because of the freedom of expression, but it is this antagonism that has been created. It is that we don't do it because this is like really the way I want to express myself. I do it. I make the cartoons, or I'm gonna basically create a work that is gonna upset this group of people because it is my right of expression. I don't think that is the point. The point is that there is this atmosphere, this environment of challenge, this environment of antagonism, and that is what is driving this, and it's not the expression itself.
I wanted to respond to what Shireen had said about boundaries. I think boundaries are not a good thing. I think they are, I don't think there's any, even physical boundaries, I think they're fluid. And I think the nature of our lives is to have the boundaries keep changing. They change as we grow, if nothing else. They change as we move through different kinds of contexts in the world, if nothing else. So I think the boundaries, religious boundaries, from my perspective, need to be looked at, and need to, if they demand it, or if one sort of looks at those things with great respect, to be changed, or to make an effort to change them. And I came from the outside, certainly from the outside of the Koran. I'm not a Muslim, and I'm not a Jew. My grandparents were, but I was raised also as an atheist. So I think that that notion of the boundaries has to be fluid.
I agree with Shireen Shat, and I think that, of course, it was not that much about religious boundaries, but also about cultural and political boundaries and opinions. And in these terms, if I talk about the piece that my husband, Oleg Mavromatti, made, he is not a person that is absolute atheist, but he wanted to use this symbol in order to talk about things that are a little bit more than or wider than just using the symbol in order to talk about religious things. He was trying to create an archetype of pain and suffering and humiliation and also repent. The problem is that most of the symbols that have been considered to be religious in Russia or in also in Eastern Europe, the meaning or the way how they are used and the way how they are translated or interpreted is appropriated only by some sort of a religious, even part of the Orthodox Church for political purposes. It is not that they actually, if they went deep into the meaning of his piece, they would actually have to support him. And the same I would say about the other pieces that have been censored for the last 10 years.
I just want to go back to the idea of boundaries. And we all have boundaries. We all have something to guide us. The question, of course, is not about whether boundaries exist. The question is regards those boundaries. Coming back to the title of our panel, Policing the Sacred. Who polices the boundaries? And going back to the question that Eleanor asked earlier, who owns religious symbols? One thing I noticed in this country when working with censored artists is that most of the artists that were censored by Catholics were Catholic artists. Probably all of them. You actually look at censored artists in America, they're probably 90% Catholic. There's something about Catholicism that wants you to go against Catholicism. But you look at Karen Finley, you want to associate her with religion, she's Catholic. Serrano, Ophelia, Wojnarowicz, they're all Catholic. They are talking about their own religion, but not in a way that the church hierarchy wants them to talk about religion, or some vocal parts of the church hierarchy, because Catholics also sometimes disagree. And that leads me to hate speech. This country does not have hate speech laws. However, most of Western Europe, Canada, Australia, Russia, they're hate speech laws. These hate speech laws are dangerous because, again, what is hate speech and how are they deployed? And we see how in Russia, hate speech laws sound good. Let's protect people's sensibilities. Hate speech laws are used against artists for artwork. Who were offended or not, we have a jail sentence right there. In Denmark, there are actually the people. Some Islamic groups tried to use them against the publisher of the newspaper where the Muhammad cartoons came out. They were unsuccessful. They were used against Welbeck in France, was brought to trial. The charges were eventually dropped, but he faced trial for an opinion he expressed about Islam. There are hate speech laws protecting religion in England. There are a lot of people in this country that want hate speech laws to be instituted. And on the surface, they sometimes don't sound that bad. No, hate speech against, we were imagining the speech we really hate, that will be the speech that will be banned. But then, whose definition of hate speech will prevail? Will it be, will my criticism of religion be taken as hate speech? Perhaps somebody could define it that way. Definitely in Russia it could be defined that way. So that's what I wanted to bring into this discussion about hate speech, that there are serious legal issues brought there, and the threat of hate speech laws being adopted in the United States.
Okay, we have 10 minutes, so we can do some questions. I see a hand back there. I'm just going to repeat the question because we don't have we're recording the session. And then I'll give it to you, but I just want to repeat the question. The question has to do with Richard's piece. How much of the reaction had to do with fear? Would it have been different if he had photocopied the piece and then woven the photocopies together?
There were photocopies.
So it wasn't a physical Quran?
Well, the physical Quran is, you have to wear gloves. There's a whole process involved with it. What I had done was went and bought in a used bookstore I live in San Francisco, bought a copy of the Koran. Okay? And then I went and bought a copy of the Bible, the Torah. The Quran, my understanding, has to be in Arabic. The piece which I wove together, was 1/3 Arabic, 1/3 transliteration into English, and 1/3 English. The Bible was Hebrew and English. So those was what's woven together. The reaction was what I described earlier. That was the reaction, regardless that there was no leeway. What I had done was desecrated books. I was accused of being a transgressor. But I think the question which Svetlana just mentioned earlier about hate speech blinds. It was blinding people. So they take the position of fear, which I think is a different discussion in terms of economics, which were involved with the show.
I don't know if anyone wants to respond. Just again, I'll repeat it. Basically, that in the U.S. there seems to be a kind of antagonism about art between the two parties. One party seems to be completely opposed to art. The other one seems to be using art in an antagonistic way, and there's no center. I'm not sure if I would characterize it that way. I don't know if anyone... Yeah.
The question in this country is that art becomes entangled in another debate, which is about government and government funding. How much government is going to give to social welfare, to healthcare, to the arts. So it's not...
Quality, beauty, aesthetics, a whole tradition of 2,500 years ago that have been ignored and thrown out the window. One side doesn't care, the other side is using art as a weapon. What I'm suggesting is that art is in a crisis, and that artists, individual artists, are fighting to restore the quality and inspiration that is missing in most of this debate. It's about government funding.
Yeah, I'm not sure I would separate it that way. First of all, I don't think the Democratic Party is particularly helpful about art either. But I have someone here who's very excited to answer this question.
I actually don't want to answer your question. I think it's the wrong place for that. That's a quality debate. That's about art school and art teachers and art museums and collectors and everything else. I do want to address something that Svetlana said, which I'm very unhappy about, which is the hate speech issue. I want to remind you that it was the hate speech in Russia sponsored by the Tsaritsa and the Orthodox Church that was the inspiration for the pogroms from the late 19th century into last week. And a book called The Protocols of the Elders of Zion is the book that's essentially inspired all the hate speech in Eastern Europe of World War II. And I think hate speech is something that not only has to be carefully legislated, it must be legislated, but you have to find the perpetrators and find out who they are. When it's the church itself, they must be indicted, they must be prosecuted, and they must be brought to trial as they are in cases of pederasty. And that is what hate speech does. It kills. It also rapes. And it's also perpetuated by the churches. And by temples and by synagogues and everybody else. So to say that it's just, we should have a totally open and liberal society without any accountability for hate speech is a very odd thing, because I know you can't possibly believe that it's okay to have those kinds of actions taking place. And that's a quality statement.
We have 5 minutes. Okay, do you want to say quickly, say something?
Thank you for your impassioned opinion, Larry. The issue with hate speech is, once you have legislation, who controls it? You're giving the government the right to determine what hate speech is, and you're silencing other speech. Do you think if there were hate speech laws when Hitler wrote Mein Kampf and when the Third Reich was coming into power, those hate speech would have affected Hitler? No, they would affect the Jews. They would be critical. It's not that there is too much speech and hate speech is so dangerous. It is that the speech that is there to counter hate speech, that speech is suppressed. And obviously that conversation is not finished. It's very much alive in today's society. But these are things to consider. When we have a law, we imagine it will serve our purposes. However, we have to imagine that it will serve other people's purposes, the people that we don't like.
We have time for one more question. Any hands? Okay.
This question is for Boryana, someone who's close to an artist that is exiled from one country to another because of freedom of expression issues. And it seems like there are different risks we're taking when we invoke religious imagery, whether it's censorship, being jailed, or being executed, depending on the hierarchy of religious religion and power. And considering the forces we have in the U.S. right now, they're coming from, I can't say news media, but a certain type of media that regales the crowbar-wielding vigilante and finds a cross that they don't like in a video art. And then again, when Muslims have a problem with the Danish cartoons, they weren't exactly on their side. But that political motivation creates a climate of hostility towards art in the U.S. that I think is unprecedented for the last 10 years. And how does that affect the global community and viewing the United States as a place where artists can come when they're being persecuted in another country, and whether it's something that you fear?
Yeah, it's a very complicated question to answer. I think, of course, this is a question of politics rather than censorship. The problem is that we have spent with Oleg several years here in the United States, and he went back to Bulgaria to renew his Russian passport, which was denied renewal last year by the Russian consulate in Bulgaria, and now he is kept there in limbo because Bulgaria is the state that has to give him refugee status, and no other country. We also asked the American embassy for help and stuff like this, but because Bulgaria is considered to be a democratic country, part of the European Union, who is considered also to be democratic, this is the place he has to apply for a refugee, and if Bulgaria doesn't give him a permission, then or a refugee status, then it means that he's denied from all other countries as well. And he has to go back to Russia, which is also considered to be a democratic country. But I just wanted to mention in this, to not make it very long, of course it is very political, and I wanted to mention another thing. There is this fuse between the church and the state power, and the way how we talk about art or freedom of speech is in Russia is as much totalitarian as the way it was in the 80s during the communist regime, because then the ideology of the party was part of the state ideology. And back then, the democratic community all over the world was very much concerned about what is going on in Eastern Europe, and about the censorship there, and all about all these horrible things that are happening there. And now it is almost silent. It's very hard to get publishing about this. So to get something like written here in the United States. When I talk to people about the conviction of Leo Tolstoy, they say, oh, we didn't know, And I mean here in the United States. So it's interesting to think about censorship also, if we think about it globally, in this kind of a relationship between global politics and censorship, because it seems to me that now the governments they have common economic interests, and therefore the rest of it in my opinion, the democratic community all over the world was used at the end of the 80s and the beginning of the 90s to change the politics in Eastern Europe, and to change also, similar to the examples in Iran, to change it from communist totalitarianism into something which is very much becoming theocracy. It is not like in Iran, of course, yet, but it's not good.
And I think we'll have to leave it there. Thank you all for coming.